There is a name written on clay tablets almost 5,000 years old, a name that appears at the precise moment when everything changed. When the world as our ancestors knew it ended in water and fire. When civilization itself was erased and had to begin again. The name is Ubara-Tutu, and according to the oldest king list ever discovered, he was the last ruler before the Great Flood swept over the earth. But who was this final king of the old world? What did he witness? And why does the timing of his reign align so precisely with the most catastrophic event in human history? A cosmic disaster that occurred exactly 13,000 years ago and left scars we can still measure today. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. Picture yourself standing in the ruins of an ancient library, not in Greece or Rome, but far older. You're in the heart of what was once Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, where the Tigris and Euphrates carved green ribbons through an otherwise merciless desert. The year is roughly 2100 BCE. You are surrounded by thousands of clay tablets, each one inscribed with the wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform script, humanity's first writing system. The air is thick with the scent of baked earth and time itself. Your fingers trace the surface of one particular tablet, and as you read the symbols, a chill runs down your spine despite the oppressive heat. This is the Sumerian king list, and what it describes is impossible. The tablet begins with a simple, profound statement. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, not invented by humans, not developed through trial and error, descended, given, bestowed from above. And then the list begins to name the rulers of this divine kingship. The first king, Alulim of Eridu, is said to have reigned for 28,800 years. The second, Alalngar, for 36,000 years. Your mind struggles with the numbers. These are not reigns, these are geological epochs, these are timescales that belong to the movement of continents, not the rule of men. The list continues through 8 kings ruling from 5 different cities. Their combined reigns total 241,200 years, nearly 250,000 years of unbroken kingship, recorded with the same bureaucratic precision that the Sumerians used to document grain shipments and tax payments. There is no indication in the text that these numbers are symbolic or metaphorical. They are presented as fact, as history, as the literal truth of how long these beings ruled over the land before the flood came and swept everything away. And then, at the end of this impossible list, you find the name that changes everything. The 8th and final king, Ubara-Tutu of Shuruppak. He reigned for 18,600 years. 5 Sa and 1 Ner in the Sumerian base 60 counting system. A Sa equals 3,600, a Ner equals 600. These are not arbitrary numbers. They are precise calculations in an advanced mathematical framework that this supposedly primitive civilization developed thousands of years before anyone else on Earth. And after Ubara-Tutu's name, the text makes a stark, chilling proclamation. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Everything changed. The world was reset. And when kingship returned, when civilization began again, the numbers were different. The new kings reigned for hundreds of years instead of thousands. Still impossibly long by our standards, but dramatically shorter than before. It is as if the rules of reality itself had shifted. As if whatever allowed the antediluvian kings to live for tens of millennia had been stripped away by the Cataclysm, leaving behind a diminished mortal humanity struggling to rebuild in the ruins of a lost age. Mainstream historians have a tidy explanation for all of this. The enormous numbers are obviously mythological, they say. They are symbolic expressions of divine favour, political propaganda designed to legitimize later rulers by connecting them to an unbroken chain of authority stretching back to the dawn of time. The flood is a mythologized memory of a severe but localized river flooding, the kind of disaster that would have been devastating to the small city-states of ancient Mesopotamia. Ubara-Tutu himself, if he existed at all, was probably a minor chieftain whose story was inflated over centuries of oral tradition until he became the last king of a mythical golden age. Case closed. File it under ancient mythology and move on. But what if they are wrong? not about all of it, but about the fundamental assumption that these texts are purely symbolic. What if buried within the mythology is a memory of something real? Something so catastrophic that it became the central organising myth of every civilization that came after? What if Ubaratutu was real? And what if the flood that ended his reign was not a river overflowing its banks, but a planetary cataclysm so severe it nearly exterminated our entire species? To understand this possibility, we must first understand who Ubaratutu was according to the texts themselves. His name appears not just in the Sumerian king list, but in multiple sources across Mesopotamian literature, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that spans thousands of years. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the most famous work of ancient Near Eastern literature, Ubaratutu is mentioned in Tablet 11, the flood narrative. Here, the immortal flood survivor Utnapishtim, speaking to the hero Gilgamesh, identifies himself as the son of Ubaratutu. O man of Shurappak, son of Ubaratutu, the text proclaims, immediately establishing the connection between the last antediluvian king and the one man chosen by the gods to survive their wraths. In another text known as the Instructions of Shurappak, we find something even more remarkable. This is one of the oldest examples of wisdom literature in human history, dated to approximately 2600 BCE, but claiming to preserve knowledge from a far more ancient time. The text presents itself as a father giving advice to his son. The father is identified as Shurappak, son of Ubaratutu. The son receiving this ancient wisdom is Ziusudra, the Sumerian name for the flood hero. In those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far remote years, the text begins, establishing that what follows comes from a time almost unimaginably ancient even to the Sumerians themselves. The advice itself is practical, ethical, moral. Do not steal. Do not play around with a married woman. Do not beat a farmer's son. It reads like a combination of the biblical book of Proverbs and basic life advice from a concerned parent. But embedded within this mundane wisdom is something profound. The clear implication that in the time before the flood, there was a functioning civilization with laws, social structures, moral codes. This was not a world of primitive hunter-gatherers living in caves. This was a complex society that had grappled with the same fundamental questions of ethics and behaviour that we wrestle with today. Now comes the critical question. When did all of this happen? When did Ubaratutu rule? When did the flood come? The Sumerian texts do not give us calendar dates. They do not say this occurred in the year X of the Common Era or Y years before the present. All we have are the impossibly long reign lengths and the clear statement that the flood marked a complete break in history, a point before which everything was different and after which everything had to begin again. But there is another way to date these events, not through the texts themselves, but through the archaeological record, through the physical evidence left behind in the soil and stone and ash layers of ancient sites. And when we look at that evidence with modern scientific tools, something extraordinary emerges. The flood was real. The cataclysm actually happened, and it occurred almost exactly 13,000 years ago. In the early 20th century, British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur, one of the great Sumerian city-states. As his team dug deeper through the successive layers of human occupation, they discovered something unexpected. A thick layer of clean, water-deposited clay, devoid of any artefacts or evidence of human activity. It was 8 to 11 feet thick in some areas. Above the clay, they found the remains of the Sumerian civilization. Below it, they found evidence of a much older culture, one that had been completely interrupted by the deposition of this massive flood layer. Woolley believed he had found physical evidence of the biblical flood. He was both right and wrong. Similar flood strata have been discovered at multiple sites across Mesopotamia, including Shurappak itself, the city where Ubaratutu ruled according to the king list. At the site now known as Tel Farah in modern Iraq, archaeologists have identified a distinct flood layer, radiocarbon dated to approximately 2900 BCE. This date is significant because it coincides with a known period of severe flooding in the region and marks a clear break in the archaeological record. The pottery styles change, the settlement patterns shift. It is as if one civilization ended and another began. But here is where the story becomes complicated. The flood layer at Shurappak, while real and catastrophic for the local population, is dated to around 2900 BCE. That is approximately 5,000 years ago. Yet the Younger Dryas impact event, the cosmic cataclysm that we now know struck the Earth, occurred around 10,800 BCE. That is 12,800 years ago, nearly 13,000 years in the past. There is a gap of almost 8,000 years between these two events. So how can they be connected? The answer lies in understanding that the Mesopotamian texts are preserving memories of not one flood, but multiple catastrophic events all conflated together into a single mythological narrative. The immediate local disaster around 2900 BC that left physical evidence at sites like Shuruppak became the historical anchor point. But the story itself, the mythological framework, the cosmic scale of destruction, the idea that the entire world was drowned and only one family survived, this comes from a much older, much more profound trauma. A species-level memory of the time 13,000 years ago when the sky actually did fall and the world actually did end. Let us step back from the dusty ruins of Mesopotamia and look at what science now tells us about that older, deeper catastrophe. Around 12,800 years ago, something struck the Earth. Or more precisely, the Earth passed through a debris field left behind by a fragmenting comet. The evidence for this event has been accumulating for decades, despite fierce resistance from mainstream academic institutions. It is called the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis, and it proposes that our planet was hit by multiple airbursts and impacts from cometary fragments, triggering a cascade of disasters that nearly ended human civilization before it truly began. The evidence is found in a distinctive layer in the geological record, dated precisely to the onset of the Younger Dryas Cold Period. This layer, discovered at more than 150 sites across 4 continents, contains a suite of impact proxies that should not be there if nothing extraordinary happened. Microscopic nanodiamonds that form only under extreme heat and pressure. Magnetic spherules created when rock is instantly melted and flung into the air. High concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements that are rare on the Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Shocked quartz grains showing the unmistakable signature of impact. And vast quantities of soot and charcoal, evidence of continental-scale wildfires that consumed roughly 10% of Earth's biomass. The pattern is clear and undeniable. Something from space struck the Earth approximately 12,800 years ago. The impact or impacts occurred primarily across North America, but the effects were global. The immediate destruction would have been apocalyptic. If you had been alive at that moment, standing anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere, you would have seen the sky light up with dozens, perhaps hundreds of brilliant fireballs. Some would have detonated in the atmosphere, creating shockwaves that flattened forests for the hundreds of miles in every direction. Others would have struck the Laurentide ice sheet that covered much of North America, the massive glacier up to 2 miles thick that was slowly retreating as the last ice age ended. The energy released by these impacts was staggering. Conservative estimates put it at equivalent to multiple nuclear weapons detonating simultaneously across an entire continent. The heat was intense enough to instantly melt the surface of the ice sheet and create vast lakes of meltwater beneath the glacier. The shock and heating destabilized the entire ice mass. Within days or weeks, catastrophic flooding began as meltwater found its way through and beneath the ice, carving out enormous channels and pouring into the ocean in quantities almost impossible to comprehend. One estimate suggests that the volume of water released was equivalent to the entire Great Lakes being emptied into the Atlantic in a matter of months. This massive influx of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the great ocean conveyor belt that regulates global climate by moving warm water from the tropics toward the poles. The circulation slowed or stopped completely. Within a single year, possibly within a single season, the Northern Hemisphere plunged back into near-glacial conditions. Greenland ice cores show a temperature drop of 9 to 14 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. The shift was so abrupt that it can be measured within individual annual layers of ice. One year, the climate was warming. The next year, the ice age had returned. But the climate shift was only part of the catastrophe. The impacts themselves triggered wildfires on a scale we can barely imagine. The heat from the airbursts ignited every combustible material for hundreds of miles in every direction. Forests that had taken thousands of years to establish were consumed in hours. The smoke and ash rose into the stratosphere, circling the globe and blocking out the sun. An impact winter set in, compounding the cooling effect of the disrupted ocean circulation. For months, possibly years, the sky would have been dark or dim, tinged with the red and orange hues of suspended particles. Photosynthesis slowed or stopped. Plants died. The animals that depended on those plants died. And the humans who depended on those animals faced starvation on an unprecedented scale. The megafauna of the Pleistocene, the great beasts that had survived multiple ice ages over hundreds of thousands of years, went extinct. In North America alone, 35 species of large mammals disappeared within a geological instant. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, giant beavers, horses, camels, all gone. The timing of these extinctions coincides precisely with the Younger Dryas boundary layer, the thin black mat of carbon and impact debris that marks the moment when everything changed. Human populations crashed as well. The Clovis culture, named after distinctive spear points found at sites across North America, vanishes from the archaeological record at exactly the same time. These were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had successfully adapted to life at the end of the Ice Age, developing innovative technologies and spreading across the continent. After the impacts, their signature tools disappear. The archaeological sites show a dramatic decline in occupation. For several centuries, it appears that human population density in North America dropped by as much as 70 to 90%, a near-extinction event for our species on this continent. But the catastrophe was not limited to North America. Recent research has found Younger Dryas boundary markers in South America, Europe, Asia, and even Africa. Platinum anomalies in ocean sediment cores from Baffin Bay, between Greenland and Canada, prove that the impact debris was deposited across a vast area. The cataclysm was truly global. No corner of the Earth was spared. Every human population on the planet would have experienced the sudden cooling, the darkening skies, the crop failures, the starvation. For those living in the impact zone, death came in minutes. For everyone else, death came slowly, over the terrible years that followed, as the old world died and a new, harsher world took its place. This is the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate change lasting approximately 1200 years, from 10 to 800 BCE to 9600 BCE. The name comes from Dryas octopetala, an Arctic wildflower that suddenly appears in European pollen records during this period, evidence that Arctic conditions had returned to regions that had been warming for thousands of years. The Younger Dryas was not a gradual shift. It was a catastrophic break, the geological equivalent of flipping a switch. And at the end of it, when the climate finally stabilised around 9600 BCE, the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the world that had existed before. This is where the story intersects with the Sumerian texts in a profound and disturbing way. Because 9600 BCE, the end of the Younger Dryas, is also the approximate date given by multiple ancient traditions for the beginning of civilization. It is when agriculture suddenly appears in the archaeological record, not as a slow evolutionary development, but as a rapid revolution. Within a few centuries of the climate stabilizing, we find evidence of domesticated plants and animals, permanent settlements, monumental architecture, and organized religion appearing simultaneously across multiple sites in the Near East. It is as if the cataclysm forced humanity to reinvent itself, as if the survivors of the impact had to make a terrible choice, adapt or die. And they chose to adapt by creating the first cities, the first farms, the first temples, the first civilization, and the very first of these sites, the oldest monumental structure ever discovered, is a place called Göbekli Tepe. Located in southeastern Turkey, not far from the ancient Sumerian cities, Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone circles featuring T-shaped pillars weighing up to 10 tons, elaborately carved with images of animals and abstract symbols. The site was built by hunter-gatherers around 9600 BCE. That date is critical. Göbekli Tepe was constructed at the exact moment when the Younger Dryas ended and the climate stabilised. It is as if the people who built it were commemorating something, marking the end of a terrible age and the beginning of a new one, recording in stone a warning or a memory too important to be lost. Some researchers, analysing the carvings at Göbekli Tepe, have suggested that they are astronomical in nature. that they depict constellations as they appeared in the sky at specific dates. One pillar in particular, known as the Vulture Stone, has been interpreted as showing the night sky on the exact date of the Younger Dryas impact event. The carved animals, rather than being simple decorations or religious symbols, may represent star patterns, an ancient zodiac. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a temple, it is a memorial, a permanent record carved in stone to ensure that future generations would never forget the day the world ended. This brings us back to Ubaratutu, back to the Sumerian king list and the flood that swept everything away. If we accept that the Mesopotamian texts are preserving a memory of the Younger Dryas cataclysm, then the timeline begins to make sense. The antediluvian kings, those impossibly long-lived rulers, represent the world before the impact. Perhaps the enormous reign lengths are not meant to be taken literally as individual lifespans, but as dynasties, or epochs, or measures of some other unit of time that was lost when the texts were copied and recopied over millennia. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that keeps researchers awake at night, the numbers are accurate in a way we do not yet understand. What if the antediluvian world, the world before the flood, was fundamentally different from ours? What if something about the environment, or the genetics of the population, or some other factor we cannot yet identify, allowed for radically extended lifespans? The texts themselves suggest this. They describe the gods, the Anunnaki, as beings who came from the heavens and ruled over humanity. They describe a golden age when heaven and earth were closer together, when the boundaries between the divine and the mortal were more permeable. And they describe this age as ending abruptly, violently, in a flood that was sent by the gods themselves to destroy their creation. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the great Babylonian flood narratives, the reason for the deluge is made explicit. Humanity had become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The gods could not sleep because of the clamour rising from the earth. So the chief god Enlil decided to wipe them out. But the god Enki, who had helped create humanity in the first place, took pity on his creation. He secretly warned one man, Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise, to build a great boat and save himself, his family, and representatives of all living things. Atrahasis is another name for Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero. And Ziusudra, as we have already seen, was the son of Shuruppak and the grandson of Ubaratutu. The genealogy is clear and consistent across multiple texts. Ubaratutu was the last king before the flood. His son or grandson was the one man chosen to survive. This places Ubaratutu at the epicenter of the catastrophe. He would have witnessed the beginning of the end. He would have ruled during the onset of the Younger Dryas, when the climate suddenly shifted and the world began to die. His reign would have been a time of terror and confusion as the established order collapsed, and the gods, or whatever beings the texts are describing, withdrew from active involvement in human affairs. And then the flood came, the great deluge, washing away everything that remained of the old world. But what exactly was this flood? If the Younger Dryas impact occurred around 10 to 800 BCE, and the flood layer at Shuruppak dates to around 2900 BCE, how do we reconcile these dates? The answer is that we are looking at layers of catastrophe, multiple events compressed into a single narrative through the lens of oral tradition and mythological time. The Younger Dryas impact was the cosmic event, the planet killer that triggered climate change and mass extinction. The flood at Shuruppak was a later local disaster, but one that became the historical anchor for the older, deeper memory. When the Sumerian scribes sat down to record their history, they conflated these events, using the recent tangible evidence of local flooding to give concrete form to ancient stories about a global cataclysm. This is a common pattern in mythology. Real historical events become embellished with elements from older stories, creating layered narratives that contain multiple levels of meaning. The biblical flood narrative in Genesis shows this clearly. It shares so many specific details with the Mesopotamian flood stories that scholars universally agree it was derived from them. But the biblical version adds its own theological framework, its own interpretation of why the flood occurred and what it meant. The Sumerian version was itself likely built on even older stories, oral traditions passed down from the actual survivors of the Younger Dryas, stories that were eventually written down and attached to historical figures like Ubaratutu and Ziusudra. So what can we say with certainty? The Younger Dryas impact was real. The evidence is overwhelming and continues to accumulate despite decades of academic resistance. Approximately 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. The impacts triggered massive wildfires, destabilized the North American ice sheet, caused catastrophic flooding, disrupted global ocean circulation, and plunged the planet back into near-glacial conditions for more than 1,000 years. Human populations crashed, megafauna went extinct, the old world ended. This is not speculation. This is established scientific fact, documented in ice cores, sediment layers, and archaeological sites across the globe. The Younger Dryas eventually ended around 9600 BCE. The climate shifted again, this time warming rapidly. Within a few decades, possibly within a few years, temperatures rose by 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. The ice sheets finally retreated. Sea levels rose dramatically as the meltwater flowed into the oceans. Coastlines that had been inhabited for thousands of years were drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. Any cities or settlements that had existed in these coastal regions, and this is where humans preferentially lived because of access to marine resources, were erased. Wiped off the map, lost beneath the waves. The survivors moved inland and started over. And within just a few centuries of this climatic stabilisation, we see the first evidence of agriculture, permanent settlements, and monumental architecture appearing in the archaeological record. Göbekli Tepe is built. Other sites across the Fertile Crescent show similar sudden developments. By 6000 BCE, true Neolithic farming communities are established. By 4000 BCE, the first cities appear in Mesopotamia. By 3000 BCE, writing is invented. And by 2100 BCE, the Sumerian scribes are recording their king lists, including the names of antediluvian rulers like Ubaratutu, preserving memories of a time before the flood, when the world was different and the gods walked among men. This is the orthodox timeline based on current archaeological evidence, but there is another possibility, one that is more controversial, more speculative, but which, if true, would rewrite everything we think we know about human history. What if there was a civilization before the Cataclysm? Not just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers struggling to survive in an Ice Age world, but an actual advanced civilization with cities, agriculture, technology. What if the antediluvian kings of the Sumerian texts were real rulers of real cities that existed before 800 BCE? What if the flood that destroyed them was not a river overflowing, not even a tsunami from melting ice sheets, but something far more catastrophic? What if the Younger Dryas' impact struck a world that was far more developed than we have been taught to believe? This is the theory of the lost civilization. And before you dismiss it out of hand, consider the evidence. Or rather, consider the absence of evidence, because that itself is revealing. We know that anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens with brains and bodies identical to ours, have existed for at least 300,000 years. For the vast majority of that time, the archaeological record shows them living as hunter-gatherers, slowly developing more sophisticated tools and social structures, but remaining fundamentally nomadic. Then, around 12,000 years ago, suddenly, everything changes. Agriculture appears, cities are built, writing is invented, civilization explodes into existence in a geological eye blink. The standard explanation is that this is simply when humans finally got smart enough, or developed the right cultural innovations, or reached the critical population density necessary for civilization to emerge. But this explanation has always been unsatisfying. Why did it take so long? Why did 300,000 years of human existence produce nothing but stone tools, and then the last 12,000 years produce everything else? Why does the explosion of civilization coincide so precisely with the end of the Younger Dryas? One possibility is that it did not take that long. That civilization had emerged before, during an earlier warm period, perhaps during the last interglacial around 20,000 years ago, or during one of the brief warm spells within the last ice age. But those earlier civilizations were destroyed by the subsequent climate catastrophes, leaving little evidence behind. The Younger Dryas' impact was simply the most recent reset, the one close enough to our own time that we still carry fragmented memories of it in our myths and legends. In this model, Ubaratutu was not a mythical figure, but a real king of a real city that was destroyed in the Cataclysm. His son Ziusudra survived because he had warning, because he had access to technology or knowledge that allowed him to build a proper shelter and ride out the disaster. And when the world stabilized, Ziusudra and the other survivors became the teachers of the new humanity, passing on whatever could be saved from the old world. This would explain many puzzling aspects of ancient history, It would explain why the Sumerians seemed to spring into existence fully formed, with writing, mathematics, astronomy, and sophisticated irrigation systems appearing within a few centuries of each other. They were not inventing these things from scratch. They were rediscovering or rebuilding them based on knowledge preserved by survivors of the previous age. It would explain the astronomical sophistication found at sites like Göbekli Tepe, where hunter-gatherers supposedly just learning to farm somehow had the knowledge and organisational capacity to move 10-ton stones and carve them with complex symbolic imagery. It would explain the worldwide flood myths found in virtually every culture on Earth, all describing the same basic story of a great deluge that destroyed the world and forced humanity to start over. And it would explain the antediluvian king list. These were not gods, they were not mythical beings, they were simply the rulers of the previous age, the kings of the cities that existed before the catastrophe. Their reign lengths seem impossibly long to us because they are being measured in a different system, or because they represent dynasties rather than individuals, or perhaps because the scribes who recorded them thousands of years later no longer fully understood the texts they were copying. But the core memory is real. There were kings, there were cities, there was a civilization, and it ended in a flood so devastating that for thousands of years afterward, every culture on Earth remembered it as the defining moment in human history, the great break between the world that was and the world that is. Ubara-Tutu, in this interpretation, becomes a tragic figure, the last king of a doomed world, a man who ruled during the onset of the catastrophe, who watched as the climate shifted and the old order collapsed, who may have even suspected that worse was coming but was powerless to stop it. He passed on whatever wisdom he could to his son, as recorded in the instructions of Shuruppak. He tried to prepare the next generation for a future he knew would be radically different from the past. And then the flood came, and he was swept away with everything else from the old world. Only his son survived. Ziusudra, the exceedingly wise, the far-sighted, the man who built the boat and saved himself and his family and the animals and the seeds. Ziusudra, who after the waters receded, prostrated himself before the gods and made sacrifice, and was granted immortality and taken to dwell in Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, the mythical land beyond the edge of the world. What is Dilmun? In the Sumerian imagination, it was a paradise, an otherworldly realm where the blessed dead went to live forever. But it may also have been a real place, an island or a distant land where the survivors of the flood established themselves, where they preserved the knowledge of the old world and tried to ensure it would not be lost. The texts say that Ziusudra's father Ubara-Tutu reigned for 18,600 years. If we take this number not as a literal lifespan, but as representing the length of time that Shuruppak existed as a city, or the duration of the dynasty that Ubara-Tutu belonged to, or even as a symbolic number with astronomical or calendrical significance, then it becomes less absurd. Many ancient cultures used reign lengths to encode other kinds of information. The possibility that the Sumerian king list is doing something similar, that it is a sophisticated historical document rather than naive mythology, is worth considering seriously. What we can say for certain is this: the Sumerians preserved a detailed memory of kings who ruled before a catastrophic flood. They recorded these kings with the same care and precision they used for historical kings whose reigns we can verify archaeologically. They placed the flood at a specific point in their chronology, separating the antediluvian age from the post-diluvian age, and they made it clear that the flood was not just a natural disaster, but a divinely ordained reset of civilization, an event so profound that it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Modern science has now confirmed that such an event actually occurred, not 5,000 years ago, not 3,000 years ago, but 13,000 years ago. The Younger Dryas impact and its aftermath match the mythological description of the flood in almost every detail. A catastrophe from the sky, global destruction, climate change, extinction events, the end of the old world, a small number of survivors, a long, terrible period of darkness and cold, and finally, when it was over, the emergence of a new world and a new humanity. If the Sumerian texts are preserving a genuine memory of this event, then Ubara-Tutu represents something far more significant than a line in an ancient king list. He represents the last connection to a lost world. He is the final link in a chain that stretches back into the deep time before the catastrophe, before the ice and fire and flood, before everything we think we know about human history began. His name has survived for 5,000 years, passed down through countless generations of scribes and scholars and storytellers. And perhaps, just perhaps, the reason his name has survived is because his story is true. In the decades since the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was first proposed, the evidence supporting it has continued to mount. Recent studies have found impact markers in ocean sediments, proving that the debris field was even more extensive than originally thought. Platinum anomalies have been discovered at sites around the world, all dating to the same narrow time window around 12,800 years ago. The correlation between the impact boundary and the extinction of megafauna has been demonstrated with increasing precision, and most compellingly, researchers have identified a potential source for the impacting comet, the Taurid meteor stream, which Earth still passes through twice a year, experiencing increased meteor activity every time we do. The Taurid stream is the debris trail left behind by a giant comet that broke apart sometime in the distant past. Most of the fragments are small, harmless, creating the beautiful meteor showers we see each year. But some fragments are much larger. And if Earth were to pass through the stream at a time when one of those larger fragments happened to be in our path, the results would be catastrophic. This is not speculation. This is orbital mechanics, and it means that the Younger Dryas impact was not a one-time fluke, but part of a recurring pattern. It could happen again. And by some calculations, we are entering a period of increased risk right now in the 21st century as Earth's orbit brings us through the densest part of the Taurid stream. This adds a chilling dimension to the ancient texts. If the Sumerians really were preserving a memory of the Younger Dryas impact, and if they understood that such events were cyclical, then the flood myth is not just a story about the past, it is a warning about the future. It is a message transmitted across 5,000 years, telling us that the sky has fallen before and it will fall again. The gods, or the cosmos, or whatever force governs these things, have struck humanity down in the past and forced us to rebuild from ashes, and we should not assume that we are immune, that our technology will save us, that we are somehow exempt from the cycles that govern the universe. Ubara-Tutu could not save his world. He watched it die, but his son survived. And through that survival, through the preservation of memory and knowledge, a new world was born. The cities of Sumer rose from the mud of Mesopotamia. The first writing was invented to record the stories of what had come before. And for 5,000 years, those records have been waiting for us to decipher them, to look past the mythology and see the history beneath, to understand that we are not the first civilization to rise, that others came before us, that they were destroyed, and that we carry within our collective memory, encoded in our myths and legends and ancient texts, a record of that destruction and a warning not to forget. The Sumerian king list ends its antediluvian section with Ubara-Tutu's name and the simple, devastating statement, "Then the flood swept over." There is no elaboration, no detailed description of the catastrophe, just that stark acknowledgement that everything changed. The kingship that had descended from heaven, that had endured for 241,200 years, came to an end. The world was wiped clean. And when it emerged again, when the kingship descended from heaven a second time and was established in the city of Kish, it was a different world, a diminished world, a world that had forgotten most of what it once knew and had to slowly, painfully rediscover it. We are the inheritors of that rediscovery. We are the distant descendants of the survivors. And the question that haunts us now, the question that drives researchers to spend their lives studying crumbling clay tablets and analysing microscopic impact debris, is simple but profound. If it happened once, will it happen again? If our ancestors witnessed the end of their world and managed to preserve a warning for us, are we paying attention? Or will we, like Ubara-Tutu, watch helplessly as our own civilization meets a catastrophe we saw coming but could not prevent? The night sky that our ancestors watched, in fear and wonder, is the same night sky we see today. The same stars wheel overhead, the same comets and asteroids drift through the darkness, and the same laws of physics that allowed the Younger Dryas impact to occur 13,000 years ago are still in operation. We have better tools now. We have telescopes and satellites and sophisticated computer models. We can see threats coming from millions of miles away. But we are also far more vulnerable than our ancestors were. They lived in small, scattered communities that could survive even if most of the world was destroyed. We live in a globalized, interconnected civilization, where the failure of a single major system, the power grid, the internet, the global food distribution network, could trigger a cascade of collapse that would make the younger Dryas look mild by comparison. This is why the story of Ubaratutu matters. Not because we can prove definitively that he was real, or that the antediluvian king list is historically accurate in every detail, but because the story he represents, the memory he embodies, is one that we ignore at our peril. We are not immune to catastrophe. We are not exempt from the forces that have shaped and reshaped our planet for billions of years, and the thin veneer of civilization that we have built over the past few thousand years could be stripped away in a day if we face the kind of cosmic disaster that our ancestors endured. The Sumerians understood this. They built their entire worldview around the fundamental truth that the world had ended once and could end again. They remembered the flood. They remembered the kings who had ruled before it. They remembered that humanity had been brought low and had survived only by the grace of the gods and the wisdom of those who prepared for the worst. And they recorded all of this not to impress us with their mythology, but to warn us, to remind us, to ensure that we would not forget. In the silent clay of ancient tablets, in the wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft earth 5,000 years ago, and then baked hard as stone, the name of Ubaratutu waits, the last antediluvian king, the final ruler of the old world, a man who stood at the end of an age and watched it pass away. His story is our story, his warning is our warning, and the flood that swept over his world and changed everything is a reminder that we live on a fragile planet in a dangerous universe, where the past and the future are linked by threads of memory we ignore at our own risk. The question is not whether another catastrophe will come. The laws of probability and orbital mechanics tell us that it will. The question is whether we will be ready, whether we will have learned the lessons that our ancestors paid for in blood and suffering to teach us, whether we will look up at the night sky, not just in wonder, but in watchfulness, remembering that 13,000 years ago, death came from above and nearly extinguished our species, and whether we will honour the memory of people like Ubaratutu, who lived through the end of their world by building ours to last, by preserving our knowledge, by preparing for the disasters we cannot prevent and surviving them with the determination and wisdom that has characterised humanity at its best. In those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far remote years. So begins the instructions of Shuruppak, the advice of a father to his son, the wisdom of the old world passed to the new. In those ancient times there was a king named Ubaratutu. He ruled from a city called Shuruppak. He saw his world dying. He prepared his heir as best he could. And then the flood came and swept everything away. That is the story the Sumerians chose to preserve. That is the warning they chose to transmit across 5,000 years to reach us here, now, at the beginning of the 21st century. Are we listening? The weight of that question hangs in the air like the dust motes suspended in the shaft of light illuminating these ancient tablets. But to truly understand what we should be listening for, we must go deeper still. We must examine not just the king list, not just the flood narrative, but the entire cosmological framework within which the Sumerians understood their world. We must look at the Eridu Genesis itself, the fragmentary but extraordinarily revealing text that tells the complete story from creation to catastrophe to renewal. Because within this broken tablet lies a narrative so sophisticated, so carefully constructed, that it demands we reconsider everything we think we know about these supposedly primitive people and the events they were describing. The Eridu Genesis, named after the first city mentioned in its opening lines, exists today as a single damaged clay tablet dating to approximately 1600 BCE. It was discovered at the ancient city of Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, and published in 1914 by German Assyriologist Arno Pobel. The tablet is broken, with approximately 2/3 of the original text missing, creating frustrating lacunae, gaps in the narrative at critical moments. But what remains is enough to reconstruct the essential story, especially when cross-referenced with later Akkadian versions like the Atrahasis and the flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The text begins not with the flood, but with the creation of the world itself. The opening lines, badly damaged but partially reconstructed, describe how the goddess Ninta, the birth goddess, creates humanity. "Let me bethink myself of my humankind, all forgotten as they are," she says. The phrasing is remarkable. Humanity is forgotten, as if they had existed before and been lost, requiring recreation. This is not the first iteration of mankind, but a restoration, a remembering. The gods fashion humans from clay, mixing it with the blood and essence of a slain deity to give them intelligence and spirit. This theme of humanity being created as a biological tool, designed for a specific purpose, recurs throughout Mesopotamian literature. We were not made for ourselves, we were made for them. The text then describes the establishment of the first 5 antediluvian cities, each one given to a specific god to oversee. The firstling of the cities, Eridu, she gave to the leader Nudimmud. This is Enki, the wise god, the god of water and knowledge. The second city, Bad Tabira, was given to an unnamed prince and sacred one. The third, Larak, to the god Pahilsag. The fourth, Sippar, to the sun god Utu. And the fifth, Shurapak, to the god Ansud. This is the city where Ubaratutu would eventually rule, the city that would be the last stronghold of the antediluvian world, the final point of connection between the age before and the age after. These 5 cities are not random. They form a geographic pattern spanning southern Mesopotamia from the Persian Gulf inland. Eridu, according to Sumerian tradition, was the very first city ever built, the place where civilization began when kingship descended from heaven. Archaeological excavations at the site modern Tel Abu Shahrain have revealed occupation layers dating back to at least 5,400 BCE, making it indeed one of the oldest settled sites in Mesopotamia. The temple complex at Eridu shows continuous rebuilding over thousands of years, each new structure built directly atop the ruins of the previous one, creating a tell, an artificial mound formed by countless generations of human habitation. At the base of this mound, in the earliest layers, archaeologists found something extraordinary. A small shrine with fish bones scattered around it, evidence of ritual offerings to Enki, the god of the watery depths, the god who would later save humanity from the flood. After establishing the cities and assigning the gods, the Eridu Genesis describes the development of civilization. Kingship is instituted, agriculture begins, the cities grow and prosper, and then comes a critical passage, one that has been the subject of intense scholarly debate. The text says that the noise of mankind became too great, that their clamour disturbed the gods, and that Enlil, the chief god, the lord of the air and the master of divine authority, could not sleep because of the racket rising from the earth below. This seems, on its surface, like a trivial reason to destroy the world. The gods are annoyed by noise, but scholars have long suspected that noise is a metaphor for something else. Perhaps it represents population growth, the explosive expansion of humanity filling the land. Perhaps it represents the social chaos and violence that comes with large populations competing for resources. Or perhaps, most intriguingly, it represents humanity becoming too self-aware, too loud in asserting their own existence and agency, challenging the divine order that had created them as servants. Whatever noise truly means, the result is the same. The Council of the Gods, led by An and Enlil, makes a decision that cannot be revoked, cannot be appealed. Mankind must be destroyed. The flood will sweep over. But here, in this moment of cosmic judgment, we encounter one of the most persistent and fascinating themes in Mesopotamian mythology. The division among the gods. Not all of them agree with the decision. Enki, the creator god, the one who had mixed the clay and blood to fashion humanity in the first place, dissents. He cannot openly defy the council, cannot break the oath sworn by all the gods, but he can find a loophole. He can warn one human without technically breaking his vow. And so comes one of the most memorable scenes in ancient literature. Enki does not speak directly to Ziusudra, the righteous king of Shuruppak, the man he has chosen to save. Instead, he goes to Ziusudra's house in the night and speaks to the wall of the reed hut, knowing that Ziusudra is on the other side, listening. "Step up to the wall to my left and listen," Enki says to the wall itself, employing a fiction so thin it is almost comical. "Let me speak a word to you at the wall, and may you grasp what I say. May you heed my advice. By our hand a flood will sweep over the cities of the half-bushel baskets and the country. The decision that mankind is to be destroyed has been made. A verdict, a command of the assembly, cannot be revoked. No order of An and Enlil is known to have been countermanded. Their kingship, their term, has been uprooted. The phrasing here is critical. Their kingship has been uprooted. This is not just about destroying people. This is about ending an entire age of divine rule, resetting the cosmic order. The text then breaks off into one of its many lacunae. The section describing the construction of the ark, the gathering of animals and supplies, the preparation for the catastrophe, all of this is lost to damage and time. When the narrative resumes, the flood has already begun. All the evil winds, all stormy winds gathered into one, and with them the flood was sweeping over the cities of the half-bushel baskets for 7 days and 7 nights. The description is stark, almost clinical. There is no elaboration about the terror of the drowning world, no lengthy passages about the suffering of those left behind, just the simple, devastating fact. 7 days and 7 nights of total destruction. After the flood had swept over the country, after the evil wind had tossed the big boat about on the great waters, the sun came out spreading light over heaven and earth. This single line carries extraordinary emotional weight. The sun comes out, light returns, life continues, but the world it illuminates is empty, scoured clean, a blank canvas waiting for new creation. Ziusudra drills an opening in the big boat and the gallant Utu, the sun god, sends his light into the interior. It is a moment of divine acknowledgement, the god confirming that the righteous have survived, that the plan has worked. Ziusudra then steps out into the new world and immediately performs a sacrifice, slaughtering oxen and sheep, offering them to the gods who had both destroyed and saved him. This is not gratitude born of relief. This is the first act of the new covenant between gods and humanity, the re-establishment of the proper order. Humans exist to serve the gods through labour and sacrifice. Even after the gods have tried to annihilate them, even after they have proven their capacity for genocidal rage, the survivors' first act is to worship them. It is a dynamic that speaks to a profound understanding of power and survival. You do not argue with forces that can drown the world. You appease them, you serve them, you hope they will be satisfied, and leave you in peace. Another lacuna follows, but the context makes clear what must have happened in the missing section. Enlil, the god who ordered the flood, discovers that there are survivors. He is enraged. How did anyone escape? Who warned them? There must have been a confrontation, an angry divine council meeting where Enlil demands answers and Enki must explain himself without admitting he explicitly broke his oath. The later Babylonian versions preserve this scene in detail, showing Enki using sophistry and clever argument to deflect blame, while ultimately convincing the other gods that it would have been wrong to destroy humanity completely. Better to have a small, chastened population of worshippers than none at all. When the Eridu Genesis text resumes, the crisis has been resolved. You here have sworn by the life's breath of heaven, the life's breath of earth, that he verily is allied with you yourself, Enki says, reminding the other gods of their own oaths and responsibilities. Ziusudra, being king, stepped up before An and Enlil, kissing the ground, and An and Enlil, after honouring him, were granting life like a god's, were making lasting breath of life, like a god's, descend into him. Ziusudra is granted immortality, the only human besides the later Akkadian hero Atrahasis and Utnapishtim to receive this gift. He is taken to dwell in Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, a paradise beyond the edge of the known world. That day they made Ziusudra preserver, as king of the small animals and the seed of mankind lived toward the east over the mountains of Dilmun. This is the end of the story as preserved in the Eridu Genesis, but it is also a beginning. Ziusudra carries with him the knowledge and wisdom of the antediluvian age. He preserves the seed of mankind, both literally in the animals and plants he saved, and figuratively in the cultural and technical knowledge he represents. In Dilmun, beyond the reach of the flood and the anger of the gods, he establishes a sanctuary where the old ways can be maintained, where the memory of what came before will not be lost. Now, if we step back and look at this narrative not as primitive mythology, but as a sophisticated historical document, certain patterns emerge that are deeply troubling for the standard archaeological timeline. The Eridu Genesis describes a world before the flood that is complex and developed. There are cities, there is kingship, there is agriculture and animal husbandry. There are social hierarchies and religious institutions. This is not a world of primitive hunter-gatherers just beginning to experiment with settled life. This is full Neolithic civilization at minimum, possibly even more advanced. And then it is destroyed, completely. So thoroughly that when civilization re-emerges after the flood, it has to rebuild from near zero. The archaeological record shows exactly this pattern, but displaced in time. The Younger Dryas' impact occurs around 12,800 years ago. The immediate aftermath is catastrophic. Human population density drops precipitously. Megafauna go extinct. The Clovis culture in North America vanishes. The archaeological signature of human activity becomes sparse and scattered. Then, after the Younger Dryas ends around 9600 BCE, we see the sudden emergence of what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution. Göbekli Tepe is built. Agriculture appears at multiple sites across the Fertile Crescent. Permanent settlements become common. By 6000 BCE, true cities are developing. By 3000 BCE, writing is invented, and Sumerian civilization is flourishing. This timeline fits the mythological narrative perfectly if we make one simple assumption that the Eridogenesis is preserving a memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, but that memory has been transmitted orally for thousands of years before being written down, allowing the details to blur and shift. The 5 antediluvian cities may not have been in exactly the locations later occupied by the historical Sumerian cities. They may have been much earlier settlements, perhaps even from before the Younger Dryas, that were destroyed and later rebuilt on the same sacred sites. The impossibly long reign lengths of the antediluvian kings may be measuring something other than human lifespans, or they may be the result of chronological confusion as oral traditions were collapsed and compressed over millennia. But the core memory remains. There was a civilization. It was destroyed by a flood triggered by cosmic forces. A few survivors preserved knowledge and seeds. They rebuilt in a new land. And from that rebuilding came the Sumerian civilization that we can actually document archaeologically. This is not wild speculation. This is pattern recognition. This is taking the text seriously on their own terms and asking what historical events could have generated these specific narrative elements. Let us now turn our attention to one of the most controversial and fascinating aspects of this entire mystery. The possibility that the antediluvian kings were not entirely human, that the Anunnaki, the gods of Sumer, were not supernatural beings but physical entities with advanced knowledge and technology. This is where we enter the realm of ancient astronaut theory, and I want to be crystal clear about something from the start. The mainstream academic consensus completely rejects this interpretation. There is no credible archaeological or genetic evidence for extraterrestrial intervention in human history. The ancient astronaut hypothesis is considered pseudoscience by virtually every qualified expert in relevant fields. And yet, when you read the texts themselves with fresh eyes, when you look at what the Sumerians actually wrote about their gods, it is harder to dismiss than you might expect. The Anunnaki are not described as ethereal spirits or abstract forces. They are described as physical beings who came from the sky, who established bases on Earth, who performed genetic experiments, who had internal conflicts and power struggles, and who eventually left or went into hiding. These descriptions read less like religious allegory and more like badly explained history. The word Anunnaki itself is revealing. It is generally translated as offspring of An or those of royal blood, with An being the supreme sky god. But another translation that appears in some texts is those who from heaven to earth came. This is a functional description, not a poetic one. It describes a point of origin, a journey, an arrival. The Anunnaki are repeatedly associated with kingship, with the establishment of cities, with the teaching of agriculture and writing and astronomy. They are culture bearers, technology transfer agents. And most intriguingly, they are said to have created humans for a very specific purpose: to work, to labour, to serve. The Atrahasis epic, which parallels the Eridogenesis, but includes more detail about the creation of humanity, makes this purpose explicit. In the beginning, the Anunnaki themselves did all the work of maintaining the world. The lesser gods, called the Igigi, toiled for eons digging canals, dredging rivers, building infrastructure. But they grew tired and eventually rebelled, burning their tools and surrounding the house of Enlil, the taskmaster god, demanding better conditions. The Divine Council faced a crisis. Who would do the work if the Igigi refused? Enki proposed a solution: create a new being. Take a primitive hominid that already existed on Earth and upgrade it genetically. Give it just enough intelligence to follow orders and perform complex labour, but not so much that it would question its role or challenge authority. Create a worker species. This is not metaphor. The Atrahasis describes in detail how the mother goddess Ninhursag takes clay, mixes it with the blood and flesh of a slain god named Wa'ila, a god who had intelligence, and uses this mixture to create the first humans. 14 birth goddesses, 7 creating males and 7 creating females, serve as surrogate mothers for the first generation. This is genetic engineering described in the only vocabulary available to Bronze Age scribes. Clay equals biological material. Blood of a god equals superior DNA or genetic information. Birth goddesses equal artificial wombs or surrogacy. The result is humanity. Lulu Amalu, the mixed creature, the hybrid. Now, to be absolutely clear, there is no scientific evidence supporting this literal interpretation. Human evolution is well documented in the fossil record and genetic data. Homo sapiens evolved from earlier hominid species through natural selection over millions of years, with no need for external intervention. The idea that aliens or advanced beings genetically engineered us roughly 300,000 years ago, which is when anatomically modern humans appear in the fossil record, has no empirical support. It is a speculative interpretation of mythological texts, nothing more. But here is what makes the speculation persistent and compelling to many people. The texts describe outcomes that actually occurred. They describe a sudden, relatively rapid emergence of behavioural modernity in humans. Around 70,000 years ago, we see the first evidence of complex symbolic thought. Art, jewellery, sophisticated tools. Around 40,000 years ago, this accelerates dramatically in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Cave paintings appear, complex burials with grave goods become common, long-distance trade networks develop, and then, after the Younger Dryas, agriculture and civilization explode into existence. From the perspective of cosmic timescales, humans went from being just another species of ape to building cities and writing symphonies in the blink of an eye. Something made us different. Mainstream science explains this through gradual cultural evolution, the accumulation of knowledge and innovations over time. The alternative explanation is that we received a boost, that someone intervened, that the Anunnaki are not myth but history. I present both views because both views exist, and the mystery of human origins is still actively debated in many of its details. What is not debatable is what the Sumerians believed. They believed they were created by the gods to serve them. They believed the gods were physical beings who had come from elsewhere. And they believed that those gods had once ruled directly over Earth but had withdrawn after the flood, leaving humanity to govern itself while remaining subtly involved behind the scenes. This brings us back to Ubaratutu and the central question that has driven this entire exploration. Who was he? Really? If we strip away the mythology and try to extract historical truth, we are left with a few solid facts. The Sumerian king list records his name as the last antediluvian king, ruling from Shuruppak for 18,600 years. He is identified as the father of Shuruppak, who in turn is father to Ziusudra, the flood hero. The instructions of Shuruppak present him as the patriarch of a dynasty, a wise king giving counsel to his descendants. The Eridogenesis places his city, Shuruppak, as the fifth and final antediluvian city, the last outpost of the old world before the catastrophe. Archaeologically, Shuruppak is a real place. The site, Tel Furra in modern Iraq, has been extensively excavated. A distinct flood stratum has been identified, dated to approximately 2900 BCE. Above this layer, we find pottery and architecture consistent with the early dynastic period of Sumerian history. Below it, we find earlier occupation from the Jemdet-Nazar period. The flood was real at this site, but this flood layer represents a local disaster, severe but not global, occurring roughly 3,000 years after the Younger Dryas impact. So how do we reconcile these dates? How can Ubaratutu be the last king before a flood that occurred in 2900 BCE, while also being connected to memories of the Younger Dryas catastrophe from 12,800 years ago? The answer lies in understanding how oral tradition and mythological time work. Stories compress. Details from different events merge together. Real historical figures become attached to older, more archetypal narratives. Ubaratutu, or a king by that name, may have actually ruled Shuruppak around 3000 BCE when the local flood occurred. But his role as the last king before disaster, became the framework onto which older memories of far more ancient catastrophes were projected. This is a well-documented phenomenon in mythology and folklore studies. The most recent tangible disaster becomes the vehicle for expressing deeper, older traumas. The flood at Shuruppak in 2900 BCE was bad enough, destroying the city and disrupting the region. It provided the concrete, physical evidence that people could point to. But the story told about that flood, the cosmic scale of it, the involvement of gods making world-ending decisions, the survival of only one family, and the need to rebuild civilization from scratch, these elements come from somewhere else. They come from the deep memory of the Younger Dryas, when the world actually did end and humanity actually did almost go extinct. Ubara-Tutu, then, is both historical and mythical, a real king whose name was preserved and a symbol of something larger. He represents the end of an age, he is the last connection to the time before, and his son Zeusudra, whether we take him as literally historical or as a composite figure representing all flood survivors, embodies the preservation of knowledge and the continuation of the species through catastrophe. This is why their names have survived for 5,000 years. Not because they were gods, not because they were aliens, but because they represented something fundamental to the Sumerian understanding of human existence. That we have been brought to the brink of extinction before, that we have survived through preparation, wisdom, and divine favour, and that we must never forget. The implications of this for our own time are sobering. If the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is correct, and the evidence strongly suggests it is, then Earth was struck by a cosmic catastrophe a mere 13,000 years ago. In geological terms, that is yesterday. We are still living in the shadow of that event. The entire structure of modern civilization, everything we consider normal about human society, has developed in the post-impact world. We have no lived experience of what such a catastrophe would mean. But our ancestors did, and they tried to warn us. Every flood myth in every culture is a warning. The Greek story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, the Hindu legend of Manu and the fish, the Norse tale of Bergelmir surviving Ymir's blood, the Aztec belief in multiple worlds destroyed and recreated, the Chinese story of Gun Yu and the Great Flood, Australian Aboriginal traditions of the sea rising and drowning the coastal lands, Native American legends across both continents describing fire from the sky and waters covering the earth. These are not coincidences. These are not independent inventions. These are the fragmented, culturally adapted memories of real events that affected the entire planet. The Sumerian version is simply the oldest written version we have, the first time someone put stylus to clay and recorded for posterity what their distant ancestors had experienced. And at the centre of that record, linking the world before to the world after, stands Ubara-Tutu, the last king of the old world, the man who watched everything he knew die, who passed on what he could to his son, and who then disappeared beneath the waters of history, leaving behind only his name and his warning. As we stand here now in the 21st century with our satellites and telescopes and early warning systems, we like to think we are immune to such disasters, that our technology will save us, that we see threats coming from far enough away to do something about them. But the Younger Dryas impact came from the Taurid meteor stream, a debris field that Earth passes through twice a year, every year, without fail. Most years, we see nothing but shooting stars, but the stream contains larger fragments, much larger, and our ability to detect and track all potentially dangerous objects in near-Earth space is still surprisingly limited. We could miss something until it's far too late to do anything about it. More troubling still, our civilization is far more fragile than the world of the hunter-gatherers who survived the Younger Dryas. They lived in small, scattered communities with basic technology. If 90% of them died, the remaining 10% could still hunt, gather, and survive. We live in a globally interconnected network of systems so complex and interdependent that the failure of any major component could trigger cascading collapse. If the power grid goes down for an extended period, if the internet fails, if global food distribution breaks, if a pandemic far worse than COVID sweeps the world, if a solar storm fries our electronics, if a volcanic super-eruption blocks out the sun, if a comet fragments in our atmosphere and ignites hemisphere-wide fires, any of these could send us back to a pre-industrial existence within weeks or months, and from there, the path back to our current level of civilization might take centuries or millennia, if it happens at all. This is the lesson of Ubara-Tutu. This is what the Sumerians were trying to tell us when they preserved his name and his story. Civilization is not inevitable. Progress is not guaranteed. The march of human history is not a straight line upward. but a cycle of rise and fall, creation and destruction, hubris and humiliation. We build, the universe tears down, we rebuild, and we must never forget that we are only here because our ancestors survived disasters we can barely imagine, and had the wisdom to pass down warnings that we have largely ignored or dismissed as primitive superstition. The Sumerian king list ends its antediluvian section with those stark words, "Then the flood swept over," and when it continues, describing the post-flood world, everything is different. The kings live shorter lives, the cities are smaller, the connection to the divine is more distant. It is as if humanity had to start over with a handicap, missing some crucial element or knowledge that the earlier age possessed. And perhaps we did. Perhaps in the chaos of the younger Dreers, in the desperate struggle for survival, much was lost. Technologies that took centuries to develop, written records, scientific knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of who knows how many generations gone, reduced to oral tales told around fires by frightened survivors to children who would grow up in a colder, harsher world than their grandparents had known. But some things were preserved, some knowledge survived, and slowly, painfully, over thousands of years, civilization clawed its way back. By 9600 BCE, when the climate finally stabilized, humans were ready. Göbekli Tepe rises from the earth, a monumental declaration that we are still here, that we remember, that we will not be erased. By 6000 BCE, farming communities dot the landscape. By 4000 BCE, cities return. By 3000 BCE, writing is reinvented. And this time we write it down. We carve it in stone and bake it in clay. We create permanent records that will survive even if we do not. And we write about the flood. We write about the kings who came before. We write about Ubaratutu. For 5,000 years, those records have waited, buried under sand and rubble, forgotten by the civilizations that rose and fell atop them, until archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries began digging them up, translating them, piecing together a story that challenges everything we thought we knew. And now we stand at a crossroads. Do we listen? Do we take seriously the possibility that our ancestors are trying to warn us about something real? Or do we dismiss it all as myth and superstition, confident in our technology and our modernity, forgetting that the Sumerians were not primitive? They were brilliant. They created civilization. They invented writing and mathematics and law and literature. And they chose to preserve this specific story, this specific warning above almost everything else. I do not claim to have answers. I do not know if Ubaratutu was a real king or a symbolic figure. I do not know if the Anunnaki were gods or aliens or simply human elites whose stories were exaggerated over time. I do not know if we are due for another impact, another reset, another age-ending catastrophe. But I know this. The Younger Dryas impact was real. The evidence is overwhelming. 13,000 years ago, something from space struck our planet and nearly ended us. And the oldest written records we have, from the most ancient civilization we know, preserve a memory of that event disguised as a flood myth, with a king named Ubaratutu standing at the threshold between the world that was and the world that came after. That is not coincidence. That is not accident. That is our ancestors doing everything in their power to make sure we remember, to make sure we prepare, to make sure that if the sky falls again, we will not be caught completely unprepared. The question that haunts me, that should haunt all of us, is whether we are listening. Whether 5,000 years of warnings encoded in myth and carved in clay will be enough to save us when the next catastrophe comes. Because it will come. The laws of orbital mechanics guarantee it. The only questions are when and whether we will be ready. In those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far remote years. So begins the instructions of Shurupak. So begins the warning from father to son, from past to future, from Ubaratutu to Ziusudra to us. The last king of the old world speaks across 5 millennia, his voice faint but unmistakable in the whisper of ancient clay. Are we listening?